Ukraine is facing a very tough situation in the eastern Donetsk region and needs faster weapon supplies and new types of weaponry to withstand Russian attacks. That's according to President Volodymyr Zelensky in an address last night. The demands come as the U.S. reportedly debates fast-tracking fighter jets and medium-range missiles directly to the front lines, weapons that would allow Ukraine to regain momentum and to take ground from the Russians. Meanwhile, Ukraine's Ministry of Health released these photographs to Reuters. It says show the aftermath of Russian shelling on the regional clinical hospital in the Kherson on Sunday. A strike on that city that killed 3 people. Missiles also fell on Kharkiv, Ukraine's second largest city. At least 1 person was killed and 3 more injured when an apartment building was hit.
The head of intelligence reported on how the situation may change in the near future. We are doing our best to ensure that our pressure still outweighs the occupiers' assault capabilities, and it is very important to keep the momentum of defense support from our partners. Speed of supply has been and will be one of the key factors in this war.
Now we're joined by military strategist and retired Army Major General Mick Ryan to break down this story a little bit more for us. Let's get into the strategic level questions. We have all these warnings that Russia is preparing to mount another serious offensive on the anniversary of the war. How seriously should this be taken, and how much of a threat can Russia still be given the current momentum of the war?
Well, good morning. We should take these threats very seriously. The reason President Putin put General Gerasimov in charge a couple of weeks ago is because he was uncomfortable with the defensive strategy of the previous commander, General Surovikin. He wants the Russian army to take back the annexed provinces, and he will be forcing Gerasimov and the Russian army to conduct offensive this year to do that.
And I want to talk about all the new weapons that are flowing into Ukraine's arsenals. We're now talking about the tanks, which have been confirmed, reports in America of medium-range missiles, as well as F-16s. We've seen time and time again that Russia had previously threatened the West, do not send advanced weapons or things will escalate. At this point, the West doesn't seem to be listening to these threats anymore. Why not? Why does Russia no longer seem to present a credible threat, at least to the West, if not to Ukraine?
Well, at long last, the West has finally called the Russians bluff. Throughout this war, the Russians have been using every advanced weapon in their arsenal, including bombers, tanks and long-range missiles, to kill Ukrainian citizens and destroy their cities. Why shouldn't the Ukrainians be able to use advanced Western systems to defend themselves? The West has finally called the Russians bluff. It's about time, and I look forward to those weapons arriving in Ukraine as soon as possible.
Well, the big question is, if these weapons do allow Ukraine to turn the tide and turn the momentum and to really start pushing Russia back out of their territory, including, as people are speculating, Crimea as well, at what point does Russia start to upscale to their strategic level weapons? They've been threatening nuclear retaliation since the beginning with tactical nukes. The question is, how much can they lose before they finally pull the trigger?
Well, Putin's key objectives out of this war are the Donbass, clearly, and to retain Crimea. So they would potentially be trigger points for some kind of use of tactical nuclear weapons. But at the same time, Putin and his regime have to balance off that this would be a pariah nation, Russia that is, for at least a generation if they were to do that. Is losing Crimea worth that? They have to make a fairly careful, strategic and very long-term judgment if they decide to do that.
So that does lead to another question. If Russia fails in this war against what was at the beginning of the war seemingly an under-equipped and relatively weak neighbor, their reputation as a superpower or even a great power is threatened to the point of non-credibility. If that's the case, does Russia not have an incentive to become, even for a generation, a pariah nation if it maintains that status?
Well, I think that horse has already bolted for the Russians. They've lost their credibility months and months ago in this war. No one sees them as a powerful superpower anymore. I think at best they're seen as a middle power that's got lots of nuclear weapons. So, Russia really needs to rethink its role in Europe and its role in the world now and in the wake of this war. The West does not want Russia to win this war. It would just encourage more adventurism by Putin and people like President Xi. It is not in the West's interest for Russia to win in Ukraine.
Can you give us a quick assessment of the current state of the war, the positions of the major blocks of power, and where we think things are going to develop over the next months or so?
Well, we're coming out of winter, and going into winter, Ukraine had the momentum and it had the initiative in this war. Its very successful Kharkiv and Kherson offensives had really put the Russians on the back foot. But the introduction of well over 100,000 mobilised troops into the Russian forces has stabilised the lines over the last couple of months. And that means the Ukrainians really need to work hard now to regenerate that momentum as they go into the offensives in this year. And that'll be in the east, but especially in the south, is really vital for them. It's the economic heartland for Ukraine, and it'll be a jumping off point for them eventually taking back Crimea.
Let's talk about long-term goals of all sides involved in this conflict. Ukraine's are obvious. It's about national survival. But let's talk about the West in general. The West is not just sending heavy weapons systems into Ukraine. They're integrating Ukraine into a global economic and financial system. You had BlackRock buying up Ukraine's war rebuilding debt for the aftermath of the conflict, as well as so many other things. What is the West's position long-term on Ukraine? What is it going to turn them into regarding Western power in the region, and how can Russia still react to that, or do they no longer have any threats?
I think it's important that we don't look at this as some grand Western plot to move closer to Russia's borders. It's just not. Anyone who's worked in government knows we're just not that competent. No, Ukraine has agency here. Ukraine made a decision some time ago that it wanted to align economically with the West, and it was happy to, think through the security side of things. But Ukraine wants closer economic and political integration with the EU. And the EU, I believe, will really have to stump up with reconstruction funds in the wake of this war. Ukraine has agency here. This isn't some green Western plot.
Okay. So definitely they have not just agency, but they have very clear national interests in this. The U.S. has a national interest in making sure that Ukraine does not fall to Russian influence. But if you're breaking down who controls what territory, ultimately, what are the lines that the West could eventually settle on? What compromises could they make if they wanted to avoid longer scale escalation of the sort that Russia has been threatening? We've been discussing whether or not they're still credible on that front, but at a certain point, if they lose enough, they will have no choice, it seems. As such, what can both sides settle on that leaves nobody happy, but nobody willing to pull the trigger?
Well, if we look back over the last 100 years, the Russians have lost far more wars than they won. So they have a lot of experience in losing wars. So it's not unthinkable that they might lose this war and pull out of Ukraine. I mean, that is an entirely plausible scenario given Russia's recent history. It is not in the West's interest, in Europe's interest for this war to go on, but it's even less in their interest for Russia to win. It would only encourage Putin and people of his ilk, and that's why Europe, the United States and other countries are putting so much support into Ukraine.
Okay, and very, very briefly, Mick, at this point, it seems as an observer in the West that the war is over on paper. It's just not on the battlefield. Is that a correct assessment?
No, it's never like that. It's not over until one side is defeated or both sides are so exhausted they want to negotiate. I think it's probably likely to be the former than the latter in this point, but there's a lot more bloodshed, a lot more territory to be taken, and a lot more destruction before this war will be over, unfortunately.
Thank you very much, Mick Ryan, for breaking this down for us and giving us a glimpse of what the road ahead looks like.